They walked along the ravine's bottom for maybe a mile. Nothing looked familiar to Lewis, but that meant little. He wasn't accustomed to paying attention to these things. He wondered briefly about the third group, but quickly put it out of his mind. It wasn't his responsibility. He reveled briefly in the freedom of irresponsibility. Fassbender stopped, one hand raised. He tilted his head, listening. Lewis heard nothing. "What?" he whispered. "Quiet," Fassbender hissed, then took a few steps to the right, arms still raised. And then Lewis heard it, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. He imagined the snuffling breath, the scrabbling claws, the thing growing as it moved, swelling like a blister, filled with a syrup of blood and pus. "Run," Fassbender said, and he was off. Lewis did his best to keep up, but the bottom of the ravine was either slick rock or wet sand, the stream just beneath the surface. His foot sunk into the sand once, up to the ankle, and he had to stop and pull himself loose, all the while imagining the thing leaping from the ledge above and landing on top of him. Fassbender was getting farther and farther ahead, not looking back. Lewis was forgotten. He moved on again, his boot heavy with water, the cold startling him awake. He heard nothing, but he felt the presence of something down in the ravine with him, something close behind. He ran, ignoring his back's complaints, ignoring the squelching of his wet boot, ignoring the panic, going like a signal flare behind his eyes. He blocked out everything but the sight of Fassbender racing forward and closing the gap between them. Fassbender was his anchor, the tether to the real world. Then Fassbender was climbing, scrambling over fallen rock that should not be there. They'd come this way, through this ravine, and there was no such barrier. There was no way they could be so turned around. Lewis tried not to think, focusing only on scrambling up after the captain. At the top of the barrier, just as Fassbender was sliding down on his butt, boots knocking rock down before him, Lewis glanced back over his shoulder, down at the shadowed path that they had just run. Nothing was there. No beast followed. He turned so that he was facing the slope of rock and slid down, scraping the palms on one hand and the knuckles of the hand holding the knife, not caring. At the bottom, he stood and turned, ready to run on, and crashed into Fassbender, standing stock still, arms at his side. Lewis took in a quick breath and froze beside him. Some of them were hanging from the gnarled branches that loomed out over the ravine. Some were spread eagle on large stones. Some had been set up in sitting positions, their backs to the canyon wall, hands in their laps. Lewis couldn't slow his mind enough to get a clear count, but he thought there were 7 or 8. They all wore blue wool uniforms, though their hats were gone. They all had been eviscerated, their insides drawn out and arranged on the ground in complicated curves and rays. The man sitting closest to where the 2 frozen men stood had not just been scalped, but the skin had been peeled from the back of his neck up and over, removing his entire face. Lewis knew this because despite the face looking down, the skin of his head lay against his chest like a gory bib. Once again, their eyes were missing, and the bodies that hung, their feet just above the ground, seemed to stare at Lewis, the dark wells of their empty sockets seeming to accuse. Lewis didn't know how long they stood there, among the reek and flies, just looking, studying, taking in the way their limbs had been split lengthwise, exposing the bone, but eventually Fassbender spoke. "That's Ellis," he said, his voice so quiet Lewis wasn't sure he'd heard. "What?" "Ellis. He was on yesterday's patrol with you and the others, woodcutting. And I think that's O'Leary." He waved a hand toward one of the hanging men. "But they weren't here," Lewis started, not really sure where this thought was going. Where was here? What part of the looping, ever-ending landscape had they now stumbled upon? How might they ever find home? And what was home anyway? A long, rectangular yard of wooden walls? Could those walls be expected to hold back whatever had done this? Whatever could twist space around them? Whatever could empty out all these men's insides onto the rock and dirt? Lewis didn't think so. So he stood beside the captain, frozen with fear, and tried to read whatever message was written in the glistening, fly-blackened intestines stretched across the ground. He understood nothing.